I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, President Barack Obama nominates a Jew to fill the seat on the Supreme Court of the United States vacated by the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. Merrick Garland, who currently serves as the chief judge for the U.S. Appeals Court in the D.C. District, was introduced to America in the Rose Garden of the White House. Merrick Garland, who was born to a Jewish mother and a Protestant father, and was brought up as a Jew, singled out his Jewish grandparents, who came to the United States to escape anti-Semitism in Russia, for being responsible for the honor of this Supreme Court nomination. With much emotion, Judge Garland explained.
My family deserves much of the credit for the path that led me here. My grandparents left the Pale of Settlement at the border of Western Russia and Eastern Europe in the early 1900s, fleeing anti-Semitism and hoping to make a better life for their children in America.
So who is Merrick Garland, and what is likely to occur in the battle between the White House and the Senate over Judge Garland's nomination? Well, you may have already learned that Merrick Garland received his law degree, magna summa cum laude, from Harvard Law School. So who better to have on our JBS phones right now to speak to these issues than is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law Emeritus of Harvard Law School, who actually clerked for Supreme Court Justice himself, Arthur Goldberg, Alan Dershowitz, whose latest book chronicles the history of Jewish lawyers, beginning with Abraham. It's aptly entitled The World's First, but certainly not last, Jewish Lawyer, available at all Jewish bookstores everywhere and on Amazon. And Alan, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Well, thank you so much. This is a good day for America. I think it's a good day for the Jewish community. When Brandeis was nominated to be the first Jewish justice, that was a big issue, and many of the Protestant leaders of America opposed his nomination, including former President Taft and the heads of the Bar Association, saying a Jew was not suited to be president. They had never been a Jew in the Supreme Court. And then for years there was what was called the Jewish seat. So it went from Brandeis, and then it went to Cardoza and Frankfurter and Goldberg and Fortas, and but now there are three Jewish justices, 5 after the passing of Justice Scalia, 5 Catholic justices, not a single Protestant justice on the United States Supreme Court. But if Garland is confirmed, the closest we'll come to having a Protestant on the Supreme Court is through his paternal lineage. But he was, as you say, brought up Jewish, and a friend of mine was his roommate at Harvard, and he lived a very Jewish life when he was at Harvard.
Did you have any contact yourself with Merrick Garland at Harvard?
I remember him. He was an outstanding student at the law school. I don't recall now whether he was a student or not. One of my friends said he was, but I've had 10,000 students.
Yes.
And unless the students speak out in class a lot, or were my research assistants, or wrote papers for me, it's unlikely that I would remember them distinctly. But when I saw him today on television, it was clear that I had remembered him. And of course, he's a very, very distinguished judge of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and an excellent jurist.
Now, I've heard Judge Garland described both as a liberal and as a right-leaning moderate. How would you describe his judicial philosophy?
I would say he was a moderate. He was a kind of down-the-middle moderate. On some issues, he was quite conservative. On criminal justice issues, you would not want to have him on your panel if you were arguing on behalf of a person charged with a crime. Interestingly enough, the person you would want to have on your panel was Scalia. Scalia was very liberal when it came to most issues of criminal justice, but very conservative on many other issues. So, the labels liberal and conservative don't really work for the judiciary. Justice Brandeis was very conservative on some issues and very liberal on others. Felix Frankfurter, the same thing. So hard to know how to categorize him. He certainly was not a flaming liberal, nor was he a reactionary Republican. He was at the center. Did he lean right? Did he lean left? I think it depended a little bit on the issue.
Okay. By the way, I mentioned that you clerked for Justice Goldberg.
Yep.
how would you describe, how would you in retrospect, describe his philosophy?
Well, there's no question he was a liberal. I mean, he was brought up in a Chicago Jewish labor family. He had been the leader of the labor union movement in the United States. He had been their first lawyer. He was the lawyer who united the AFL and CIO together. He was an unabashed liberal, no doubt about that. He came to the court with an agenda. He wanted to see the abolition of capital punishment. That was my first assignment, to try to get capital punishment abolished. He wanted to see the end of racial segregation. He came to the court with a liberal agenda, and I think one of the reasons he left the court was it was not an activist enough place for him to satisfy the liberal agenda he wanted to see for the country. So Goldberg, there's just no doubt that he was a liberal on virtually every issue.
Okay, I ask you to reminisce a moment because you have had a behind-the-scenes experience with the Supreme Court of the United States. Speak for one moment about the feeling of the Supreme Court in itself as a community and why it is so important for America to have 9 sitting justices as often as possible.
Well, we should always have 9 sitting justices. I had a remarkable experience about a year ago. It was my 50th anniversary of being a clerk on the Supreme Court.
Wow.
And the justices invited us back to have lunch with them. And so all the remaining clerks, there were I think 17 of us who were still alive from the early 1960s, came back and had lunch with the justices. And they were fascinated by us. They wanted to hear how the Supreme Court operated back in the day.
Yes.
And so, we were telling them how it was in the 60s and how different it is today. First, when I was a clerk, there were only 2 clerks for each justice, so it was a much more intimate setting. The chambers was just 1 secretary, a justice, and 2 law clerks. There were just 4 of us. Today, there are about 20. There are 4 or 5 law clerks. There are several secretaries. It's a much larger operation, a much less personal operation. And, the justices and the law clerks worked very, very closely together. I worked on virtually all of Justice Goldberg's opinions, some of the most important opinions, the Escobedo opinion, Murphy versus Waterfront, very important desegregation cases, and Justice Goldberg remained close to me until the day he died, as did Judge David Bazelon, for whom I clerked on the D.C. Circuit, the same court that Merrick Garland sits on today. In fact, the same position. My judge, Judge Bazelon, was the chief judge, and he was on the short list to be on the Supreme Court when Goldberg got that appointment. And it was interesting because he and Goldberg were the closest of friends. They grew up in Chicago together. And it was between Goldberg and Bazelon, and Goldberg got the job, and I was with Bazelon when that announcement was made, and it was a combination of joy and disappointment that he didn't get it, but joy for his close friend for getting it.
Do you have any doubt that Merrick Garland would be suitable and a good member of the Supreme Court?
Nobody can have any doubt about that. There isn't a Republican in the world who would have any doubt about that. You ask Ted Cruz, he wouldn't have any doubt about that. He knows Judge Garland very well, and I want to issue a challenge to my former student, my friend Ted Cruz. He says he is the constitutional candidate. I want to hear him defend the Senate Republicans who refused to give a hearing to Merrick Garland, who's as qualified as anybody who's ever been nominated to the Supreme Court. Cruz would not doubt Merrick Garland's nominations. Nobody would. But I'd like to hear how he can justify the Senate not satisfying its constitutional obligation. The Constitution doesn't say the Senate can refuse to consider a nominee. It says that the President shall nominate and, with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint. So I think the Senate has an obligation to move forward and decide whether or not to consent to this very, very excellent nomination.
Okay, I want to talk to you one more moment about this entire controversy, which it will now dominate talk television and talk radio. Alan, the more I listen to politicians, Democrats and Republicans alike, the more I find that their statements have more to do with whose ox is being gored than it does to principle. How do you feel about the Republican-held Senate stating, again, it's not about whether it will confirm. What's upsetting you is it won't even hear the nomination. But wait 1 second. Alan, do you doubt for one moment that if everything were reversed, Democrats would not be arguing the same thing?
Absolutely. I don't doubt it for a minute. If the shoe were on the other foot, we'd hear the same thing. In fact, we have heard it
Yes.
from both President Obama and from Vice President Biden.
Good for
you.
They
were both wrong.
Good
President
for you.
Obama was wrong when he decided to filibuster Alito. Vice President Biden was wrong. I think they now know they were wrong. But two wrongs don't make a right.
Right.
We the people have to stand up for the Constitution. If neither party is prepared to defend the Constitution and do the right thing constitutionally, we have to demand that they do the right thing. And two-thirds of Americans across party lines want the Senate to consider and vote up and down on this nomination.
By the way, there is a distinction, is it correct, between whether they hold hearings and whether they confirm his nomination?
Oh, of course, until Brandeis, there were no hearings. There were never hearings. In the 19th century, there were never hearings. They just had an up-and-down vote. And remember that when Chief Justice Marshall was nominated, he was nominated by Adams, who had already lost the election to Jefferson. And nonetheless, he was approved and became one of the great Chief Justices in history. There's no obligation to hold hearings. There's an obligation to have an up-and-down vote. And I think they ought to have an up-and-down vote. I think he ought to be confirmed. And I think both parties ought to be ashamed of themselves for the way they have politicized judicial nominations over the last 30 or 40 years.
Again, good for you, Alan. By the way, it's not fair to ask you to be a prophet. But again, you are behind the scenes so often. What's your instinct? Will the Senate be forced to consider this nomination, or will they duck it?
Tragically, my instinct is that they'll duck it and that they'll get away with ducking it, and hopefully it'll become an issue in the election. And, the only way they would ever let it go through, and this may have been part of President Obama's calculations, is that Merrick Garland is a moderate. And if Hillary Clinton is elected, she may pick a much younger, much more liberal, much more activist justice who would serve for 40 or 50 years instead of 10 or 15. So Republican conservatives might think, particularly if it looks like Clinton is going to get elected, that their interests would be better served by confirming this nomination and not holding open the possibility that they may get a worse nomination. Or Republicans might also be frightened as to who Trump would nominate for the Supreme Court. Is he going to nominate his sister, who now sits on the Third Circuit? Is he going to nominate somebody who's not even a lawyer? You don't have to be a lawyer to be nominated to the Supreme Court. And so I think they know they're buying a pig in a poke if they nominate Donald Trump. And if he were to get elected president, nobody knows what kind of a nominee he would put forward.
Yes. By the way, you outline the possibilities so beautifully. It'll be fascinating to see where the Republicans go. So while we're talking politics, Alan, I want you to look with me for a moment at the current primary election races. The main players this election season are clearly Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. First, I believe you know Bill and Hillary pretty well. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. No, I've known them for years and years and years. We regard them as personal friends. We've had dinner with them many times on Martha's Vineyard. We've been to the White House on numerous occasions when he was president. Also, I was to the White House on numerous occasions when Obama was president. Of course, that stopped once I wrote my book, The Case Against the Iran Deal. But, I know pretty much all the candidates except Kasich. He I don't know at all, but the other candidates I know, and I know some of them pretty well.
How well do you know Donald Trump?
Well, I've met him on a number of occasions, and I've always liked him as a person. When I've met him, he was perfectly reasonable. I didn't see any of what I've seen in recent days. But let me tell you, I'm as worried about Sanders as I am about Trump. And I'm worried about both of them, not because of who they are, but because of who support them. Sanders is supported by some of the worst elements in America, some of the most virulently anti-Semitic, anti-Israel groups, and he has not distanced himself from them. We've all demanded of Trump that he distance himself from David Duke. I want to see Sanders distance himself from Move On, from Black Lives Matter, from Code Pink, from Students for Justice for Palestine, all of whom are determined not to let any pro-Israel speakers speak on campuses. They have blocked people like me from speaking on campus, and these are the people who are going to Trump demonstrations and trying to stop Trump from speaking. And I think that Sanders has been let off the hook. He is responsible, as much as Trump is, for his followers. And what I'm so worried about is empowering organizations like Move On and radical leftists, people like Waters, who was one of the Pink Floyd people, who is one of the most active leaders of the BDS movement, is very supportive of Sanders. Sanders must now distance himself from his radical left anti-Israel and anti-Semitic supporters. That's a greater danger on the left today than it is on the right, and we're ignoring it at our peril.
You know, but Alan, you and I don't have a social relationship outside of the work I do, and you've always been extraordinarily kind to me, giving your time on the air. But although we don't know each other in a social setting, I continue to be so impressed by your ability or your readiness to say what you believe, even though it very often will ruffle feathers, and the feathers are ones that are part of the community that you have been, your community. And so it's amazing to me that you took the stand you did on the Iran deal, and it's amazing to me that you would say this, which I know you believe, but there are few people who would have had the courage to say what you just said.
Well,
now,
I appreciate that. I mean, that's the reason I could never get into politics. It's the reason I was never nominated to be on the Supreme Court, because I would be opposed by the left as well as the right. And I'm hated by the hard left even more than I'm hated by the hard right. And historically, the Jews have always been caught between the black and the red. We thrive with centrist governments. We are always oppressed by the extremes, whether it be the extreme left, the way Stalin killed so many Jews and the Bolsheviks killed so many Jews, or the extreme right with Hitler and the pogroms and other things. So I'm a big supporter of centrist governments. I'm a liberal, not a radical. And my greatest enemies in the world are on the hard left as well as the hard right.
Yeah, it is fascinating. Again, I give you enormous credit. Stay up one moment on this issue of the rally. There are many people who immediately dismissed any responsibility by those who were protesting, even though it became clear that the protest against Donald Trump's rally in Chicago last week was a very carefully and long-term organized rally that involved MoveOn.org. It seemed to involve
Black Lives Matter as well.
Yes, Black Lives Matter, and some Sanders supporters. And I said to myself, I'm surprised the Jewish community isn't offended as we would be if a Michael Oren is not permitted to speak at...
It's the same people. And remember, the very same people who were at the Trump rally were the people who disrupted the Chicago gay rally. Remember, there was a rally?
Yes.
Gay Israelis who were trying to build bridges with gay people from all over the world, and Black Lives Matter and other organizations like that disrupted that and prevented it from going forward. The hard left does not support freedom of speech. It does not support freedom of expression. It does not support the ability of people to express views different from the ones they want. And there were people at the Trump rally that were saying hate speech has no place in America. It's not protected by the First Amendment. And so we have to understand that the enemies of Trump, who are trying to stop him from speaking, are also the enemies of Israel, who are trying to stop people like me and Michael Oren from speaking. I recognize these people. These are the people who try to break up my speeches and have succeeded in doing so on several occasions.
Yes.
When I spoke at University of Massachusetts, it was broken up. When I spoke at the University of California at Davis, there were attempts to break it up. When I spoke at Johns Hopkins University, people walked out and tried to get me banned on the campus as a result of the fact they said I was harassing the students by not acknowledging that Israel commits war crimes. Can you imagine that?
No.
That they want me to say something which I don't believe is true in order to be able to speak on their campus.
Yes.
That's the kind of anti-free speech people that we have to be as concerned about as we have to be about the people who would throw sucker punches and try to fight back against the disruptors.
Yes. Now, I have been dismayed that Trump has used some of the language he's used.
Me too.
I was upset that he seemed to support his supporter who sucker punched a protester. However, what it seemed to me, and I want to hear whether you agree with me or whether you think I'm overstating it, the liberal group that was protesting in Chicago
They were not liberals. They
Okay.
were radicals. They were not liberals. Liberals don't try to shut other people down.
But I want to tell you what it felt like to me, and you tell me if you feel I'm overreacting. It was reminiscent to me of the brown shirts in the Nazi era, who would do anything, including violence, to stop people from speaking. What's your sense?
I don't make analogies to Nazi Germany because nothing is in any way comparable to what went on there. But I think we have to be very concerned about any group that thinks it has a monopoly on truth, and any group that tries to shut down other groups from speaking. I got into a lot of trouble with my mother when I defended the right of the Nazis to march through Skokie, Illinois.
Yes.
By the way, Judge Garland comes, I think, from Skokie, Illinois, and it's a community which has a lot of Holocaust survivors. And it was outrageous for the Nazis to march through Skokie, but it was wrong for the city of Skokie to try to ban them. In America, everybody gets the right to express themselves, whether it's Martin Luther King walking through white neighborhoods trying to provoke segregationists or Nazis. The Constitution doesn't distinguish between Martin Luther King and Nazis. Everybody has the right of free speech under our Constitution, and it doesn't distinguish between Sanders on the one hand and Trump on the other. So we have to be just as concerned for Trump's right of free speech as we are for anybody else's right of free speech.
Beautifully said. So coming back to Trump, Alan, how do you explain his unexpected popularity and political success?
Well, I think he's appealing to some of the worst elements in American society, and he's saying things and legitimating things that are said in bars after a few drinks and that are not generally said in polite society. And he generalizes too much based on race and ethnicity and gender, and it's shocking to me that he has the kind of support he has. It may not be 50%, but he has more support than anybody who had expressed views like that has ever had in the past. And it shows Americans are angry, they're frustrated with the political process. But look, it also shows that in every country there are groups of people who are xenophobic, who are afraid of immigrants, who are afraid of people of diverse backgrounds, and we have to be concerned about that.
There are many Jews who say to me, Alan, quietly, but they say it clearly, they're going to vote for Trump. I don't believe these are bad people. I don't believe they're racist people. I don't believe they're xenophobic people. And I find that although there is an element of truth to what you say, the Trump phenomenon is a product of something much larger. And we have many Democrats who are crossing over and voting for him. It's not all about bad people voting for Trump.
Look, let's remember, too, that here I'm not making a comparison to Nazism. I'm distinguishing between Nazism and Italian fascism. But a lot of very good people voted for Mussolini, including many Jews who lived in Italy, who thought that a strong leader was necessary to undo the corruption in the government, to undo the inflation, a whole range of things. So Jews did vote for Mussolini when he first came to power. Jews voted for Berlusconi. Jews today support Putin in Russia. And so, the fact that there are Jews who will vote for almost any candidate, no Jew will vote for David Duke, obviously, or would any Jew vote for Adolf Hitler. But when we're talking about people who are not like that, but who represent a kind of outsider perspective, a strongman perspective, why are Jews different from any other group? You're going to find some Jews who are going to be somehow sympathetic to that perspective.
Okay. Do you believe Donald Trump could win the Republican nomination?
Oh, I think it's likely he will win the Republican nomination. I think it's unlikely he'll win the presidency, but it's possible.
Okay.
And I do think we may see a situation, if he's nominated by the Republicans, where he actually wins the popular vote but not the electoral vote. Because in states that he's going to win, like in the Deep South, he's going to win overwhelmingly. But it doesn't matter whether you win by one vote or, a million votes on the Electoral College. And I don't see him winning Ohio. I don't see him winning Pennsylvania. I don't see him winning New York, California. So I think the large electoral vote states will go for Clinton, but some of them will be close votes.
Okay.
But it's possible that he could win the popular vote. I don't see a route for him winning the Electoral College, but look, anything's possible. Who knows? for sure.
Alan, if by some chance, incidentally, I agree 100% with you, but if by some chance he is elected president, what do you believe it will really mean for America over the following 4 years?
Well, I think America will lose respect in the international community, but it gained a lot of respect when Obama was elected, and it didn't change the world very much. It certainly didn't improve it much for the better. Obama gets the Nobel Peace Prize like the day he's elected, and the world is a much less safe place 8 years later than when he entered the presidency. I don't see it as any safer today. I see it as less safe. I think the Iran deal made the country less safe. I think Russia's intrusion into Syria made it less safe. I think the Sunni-Shia divide makes it less safe. I think the growth of ISIS, that he called the junior varsity, makes it less safe. So I don't think Obama has done a great deal to make the world a safer place or a more peaceful place despite winning the Peace Prize. So unclear what it would do. It would hurt America standing abroad. It would create less support, I think, around the world for Israel. I think it would hurt Israel, ultimately. Although the Trump might be very pro-Israel. Nobody knows. Nobody really knows what his foreign policy is. It's the very unpredictability of his foreign policy that I think frightens Israel. Israel needs predictability, and it has predictability, more or less, with Clinton. It would have predictability with Cruz, less so with Kasich, because he doesn't really have a long history on the Middle East, but the least of all with Donald Trump. Donald Trump, of course, lives in a Jewish world. Many of his closest friends, associates, we all know his son-in-law and grandchildren and daughter are Jewish. But that doesn't tell us where he's going to come down when it comes to the nitty-gritty of supporting Israel militarily and in other ways.
Alan, as always, you add an important perspective to issues, and I thank you so much for taking the time once again to speak with us on JBS.
Thank you. Be well.
We'll speak again soon. The thoughts of Alan Dershowitz, Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law Emeritus at Harvard Law School, whose latest book, again, chronicles the history of Jewish lawyers, beginning with Abraham. It's entitled The World's First, but certainly not last, Jewish Lawyer. You can get it at any Jewish bookstore and, of course, on Amazon. And this is clearly a most unusual, exciting, entertaining, and momentous election cycle, and we'll continue to look at it through a Jewish lens. I hope it's something that's helpful to you. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, to the associate director of JBS, Dara Golub, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.